take like a half a second to start up. Once you see the battery symbol, you know it's on.
Perfect.
You know,
If somebody goes on at length, I'm going to give like the knowing look. it's real short, but we have the first question. Let's.
I went up to my room, I opened Kurds.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. There we go. I know it's raining outside, but we can be awake and excited and lively in here. I'm Michael Barr. I'm the Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy here at the University of Michigan. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the Ford School, to welcome our wonderful panelists. We're going to hear from four distinguished career diplomats on the topic of the U.S., Iran, and security in the Persian Gulf. Not a small or uncomplicated topic. The director of the Weiser Diplomacy Center, my colleague John Ciccari, will introduce our honored guests in just a minute. Before he does that, I want to just say a few words of welcome and a few words about the Weiser Diplomacy Center. Today's event is the final event in our semester-long series that has officially launched the Weiser Diplomacy Center here at the Ford School. Briefly, the mission of the Weiser Diplomacy Center is to provide practical training to students interested in international affairs, to inform research on topics related to diplomacy, and to serve as a hub for the University of Michigan's engagement with the foreign policy community. The Weiser Diplomacy Center launch series has brought an amazing array of visitors here to the Ford School over the course of this semester. We've hosted two former Secretaries of State, a former Assistant Secretary of State, a former Ambassador to the United Nations, former National Security Advisor, and the current U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, who was recently nominated to serve as Deputy Secretary of State. So not a bad lineup, even before today. We have a wonderful panel for today, of course, as well, and as I said, John will introduce the speakers more in detail. The Weiser Diplomacy Center series I've just described, I think, elevated the caliber of discussion about diplomacy and about foreign policy here at the University of Michigan. And it, frankly, elevated the Ford School's profile in broader circles of policymaking and among diplomats in Washington, D.C. and around the world. For making all of this possible, I want to offer my deepest gratitude to Ambassador and Mrs. Weiser, Ambassador Ron Weiser and Mrs. Eileen Weiser, who are here with us today, and to their entire family for their generous gift and for their vision of this amazing program here at the Ford School. So please join me in thanking Ron and Eileen. Many of you will know that Ron served as U.S. Ambassador to Slovakia, and Eileen served alongside him in their time in Bratislava. And they are both passionately committed to the importance of diplomacy and to the men and women who serve our country abroad. We're grateful for their friendship and strong support of the Ford School and, more broadly, of the University of Michigan. Ron and Eileen, the success of this launch series has, I hope, reflected the legacy of your work and the great gift you've given to our community. And, as I said, we are deeply grateful. You will note that today's event and the rest of the launch series was also hosted as part of the Ford School's Conversations Across Difference initiative, bringing people from lots of different political backgrounds and perspectives here to the Ford School to talk about foreign policy. Practicing diplomacy both abroad and here at home is essential for working through moments where differences seem insurmountable. The art of talking and of listening across political and other differences is critical for advancing public policy and diplomacy alike. With that, let me turn things over to John, who will introduce our panel.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I would like first also to add my thanks to the Weiser family, as well as to the American Academy of Diplomacy, with which we've been fortunate to partner to bring today's event together. The topic we're going to address is obviously timely and extremely important. We're going to talk about U.S.-Iran relations, the nuclear deal, politics and security in the Gulf more generally, and of course those issues are linked to a whole range of other regional issues relevant to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, from Israel and the Palestinian territories to the conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan, and beyond. And to have a discussion on such an important and wide-ranging array of issues, we have assembled a real dream team of diplomats with experience in the region. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and trust me, introducing them in a time-efficient manner requires a lot of distillation of their incredible accomplishments across decades in U.S. foreign service. I'm going to start on my left, your right, with Ambassador Gerald Firestein, who is a 41-year career veteran in the U.S. Foreign Service, now retired. He was ambassador to Yemen during the Obama administration from 2010 to 13, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from 2013 to 16, and has had many other crucial posts, including Deputy Chief of Mission in Pakistan, as well as senior posts in the State Department's Counterterrorism Bureau, and postings elsewhere in the region in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Lebanon, Jerusalem, and Tunisia. He's now Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, which, as many of you know, is a leading think tank in Washington. Immediately to his right is Ambassador Patrick Theros, who's President and Executive Director of the U.S.-Qatar Business Council. He also has a 35-year foreign service career with many distinguished posts, including as U.S. Ambassador to Qatar, and as advisor to the Commander-in-Chief for Central Command, which is the U.S. military command with coverage of the Middle East region. He has also been Deputy Chief of Mission in Jordan and the United Arab Emirates, as well as an economic and commercial counselor in Syria, among other roles. Ambassador Ronald Newman, to his right, is President of the American Academy of Diplomacy, and served 3 times as ambassador to Algeria, Bahrain, and most recently to Afghanistan from 2005 to 7. He also served just prior to that in Baghdad, coordinating the political aspects of the military intervention in Iraq at the time. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs during the Clinton administration, and he's had other senior roles in the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, Iran, Senegal, and Maine State. I think you get the idea. There's a tremendous amount of collective expertise on the Middle East and adjoining areas here. And last but not least, closest to me to moderate today's discussion is Ambassador Deborah McCarthy, who served as U.S. Ambassador to Lithuania during the which is during the Obama's second term. She was also Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, and served, among many other important roles, as Deputy Chief of Mission in Greece and Nicaragua, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Narcotics and Law Enforcement. She is going to take it from me in a moment and moderate a conversation for about 45 minutes with our expert guests before we open to all of you. And for your questions, you'll see people going around with note cards. Please pass your questions in writing to them, and they'll bring them down to us, where Chad and Karuna will select questions that are representative of the group to pose to our expert panel. So thank you again to our guests, and we look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you.
Well, I feel very privileged to be here and also to be directing and moderating the Dream Team here. By the way, the Dream Team was the basketball team of Lithuania, but that's a separate issue. I won't go into that. As you can see, with the vast experience that they have all across the Middle East, deep experience from young years in the diplomatic service to the senior years in the diplomatic service, I wanted to start the panel as follows: to talk a little bit about what's happening inside the region. Then we'll get to what's happening between the U.S. and Iran. And then if we have time, we'll put it in the bigger geopolitical context. So to draw on your deep history, knowledge of the history of the culture, and obviously of our bilateral relations, I wanted to ask each of you to talk for about a couple of minutes on the power dynamics that are taking place today within the region, and specifically to talk a little bit about how Iran is perceived by its neighbors in the Gulf. So Jerry, would you like to start?
Thank you, Deborah, and delighted to be here with all of you today. The basic elements of the power dynamics in the region are particularly the competition between Iran and the major states of the GCC, of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and of course between Iran and Israel as well. And so when you look at when you look at the reach of the region, what you're looking at really is the reaction of the other states to what is broadly perceived as Iran's expansionist programs, its search for hegemony in the region, and the reaction of those states to what they see as the threat from an expansionist Iranian state. And that, of course, plays into what we're going to be talking about a little bit later on in terms of U.S. and Iran and the other states. So 3 aspects of Iranian behavior very quickly. One is the ballistic missile programs. Second is Iranian interference in the internal affairs of its neighbors. In the Gulf context, that means particularly Yemen and Bahrain. And then third is Iranian support for terrorism and how the region responds to those 3 perceived threats.
You want to comment?
Yeah. Thanks again, Deborah. All those threats are real. They are so perceived on the Gulf side, but you have to take one thing into context. This is not a new development. I've talked to many Gulf leaders, all of whom say it was the same in the days of the Shah. We have been around in this area for the last several centuries. We've always looked at Iran as a predatory power, as someone trying to control us. So this is not terribly new. In fact, if anything, for the small states of the Gulf, the problem in the last century or so has gotten much more difficult because there's now 2 predatory powers. One is Saudi Arabia on one side, which both has a dispute with Iran and is seen as expansionist and hegemonistic by the small states, all of whom have reacted in more or less the same way for the last 2 centuries, which is trying to find an outside protector. Early on, it was the Ottomans, it was the British. The Gulf states were prepared to, give up a certain amount of their independence in return for that protection. After the British left, there was a bit of a hiatus because we were seen, the United States, the remaining Western superpower, was seen as supporting both Saudi Arabia and Iran against their interests until the Iranian Revolution. They saw Iraq as a valuable, not ally, but as a valuable counterbalance to both countries for years. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was seen as a plus for most of the Gulf states except Kuwait. And when we, in effect, took them out, we disturbed this tripod, their own balance of power. So Iran is the strongest country in the Gulf far and away, and without outside protection would be the principal threat to the Gulf states. However, this is not to say that there are not other threats as well, such as Saudi Arabia.
Okay, thanks. Ron?
Thanks. Iran definitely a threat, although perceived differently, somewhat differently in different countries. For the UAE, even when I was there 20 years ago, it looks at Iran, they've just moved up the ladder of paranoia, but remembering that even paranoids have real enemies. But there are things which are changing in the Gulf. The leadership of the states in several cases has changed and is younger and is pursuing some more dynamic courses, and in some cases, particularly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, breaking away from the traditional, very conservative, almost passive, defensive approach to power and sort of feeling their musculature and challenging much more so old dynamics. At the same time, you have a real doubling down of monarchies defending monarchical systems. And there's a tendency, particularly in the West, to say, monarchies, old news, trash heap of history, gone. We've done that too. Back in the 60s, when Arab nationalism came in, it was, these people are done for. Wrong, they outlasted all the Arab national regimes. And they are bidding fair to do it now, in some cases by doubling down. They've become more repressive. They're less tolerant, particularly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, of various kinds of criticism while liberalizing the social benefits. So that it's a mixture of on one respect, very liberal regimes. You know, Christian churches are open, Jewish centers are open in various places, and at the same time, internal repression if you get out of line. But they're all still pretty popular. I would say their chances of remaining are pretty good. You could get into various different cases, and nothing is guaranteed, but the chances of them surviving in this form of government, rather than they are not moving to democracy, and they are doubling down on not moving. And for them, the lesson of the Arab Spring is this thing is awful. Look what happened when you pulled down these regimes. You got chaos, you got bloodshed, you got all kinds of disruption that is still going on, and a lot of loss of life, and that's not a really pretty picture. We don't want to go there. And the last thing I would just note in passing is, without trying to bring it out, is that these countries are very different from each other. There's a tendency in the U.S. to, see the smaller Gulf states as being very much, they're just little Saudi Arabias. They're all a bunch of guys running around in bed sheets. But in fact, they're very different from each other. The Omanis, Qataris have better relations with the Iranians. They have historical differences with each other. And I won't go through them, except to say that the notion that they are similar in how they regard their citizens and how they work with each other and how they work with their own people, the idea that that is the same in each of them is in fact completely incorrect.
That's a good point. Let me turn now a little bit to the relationship the United States has with Saudi Arabia as we build up to other things. We have a strong defense and security relationship. Many have criticized the U.S. for overlooking Saudi political and human rights abuses. The U.S. Congress attempted to pass a resolution to end American military involvement in Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. This was in reaction not only to the human suffering in Yemen, but also to the Khashoggi killing. Jerry, maybe I'll start with you. Can you give us an inside view of the U.S.-Saudi relationship? How does it work? And in particularly, how does our diplomacy balance security interests with our support for human rights in this part of the world?
Thanks, Deborah. And it's a very difficult balance to strike, because I think, as Ron said, we're dealing with political systems, with systems of government and society that are very different from ours, where the ability of the two sides to really understand one another and to coordinate and cooperate is limited. What we have with Saudi Arabia is a relationship that really goes back at least to the end of World War II, in some ways even before the end of World War II, that has been built around two core pillars. One is energy and recognition of Saudi Arabia as the paramount producer of oil in the world, and therefore a major anchor for global economic security. And then the other aspect, the other pillar, is what we have done with the Saudis over the course of these past 70 years in order to promote regional security and stability, partially in terms of building up Saudi Arabia's own defense capabilities. And the second aspect is how we work with the Saudis to promote regional security in places like Afghanistan, where we work very closely together, all the way through to the Gulf, to Syria, to Iran. So these have been core principles that every U.S. administration has pursued, going all the way back to the Roosevelt administration. Republican, Democrat, it hasn't really mattered. We have a stressful situation right now where we do have some significant differences, and those differences reflect particularly our different views about the rights of citizens, the interaction between citizen and state, the rights particularly for women, for other human rights, civil liberties, where this has created real tension and friction between our bilateral relationship. And so the question is, how do you address that? How do you balance between the partnership that we have preserved for all of these years against what has been this kind of fractious period in our relationship. And in my own view, and in the view of the Obama administration and now of the Trump administration, we need to look at what the core U.S. interests are in the region, which are primarily the stability and energy pillars, and to what extent or the other do you then press on these human rights. My own view is that we have not pressed as much on the human rights side as we should recently. We should take the Khashoggi murder more seriously than we have. We need to correct that balance, but I also believe that at the end of the day, we do need to recognize that preserving a good, strong Saudi-U.S. relationship is important for us to achieve our broader objectives in the region.
I just wanted to add a note, perspective I got in Bahrain when I was out there last, because we tend to be very certain of our moral rectitude as we look at something like the murder of Mr. Khashoggi. But when I was in Bahrain, what I got from a mixed group, Sunni and Shia, was, hey, wait a minute. We absolutely depend for our security on Saudi Arabia. This Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is undertaking absolutely critical reforms that are essential for the stability of the place. By the way, you know, you guys go on having your relations with Russia, even though Putin goes around murdering dissidents in various different countries. So why are you so hung up and in danger of destroying this relationship and bringing us into danger as well over one killing here when you tolerate multiple killings over there? I don't necessarily say that's the view you should take. I just lay it out for you to understand that there are different senses and different views of ways of looking at this thing.
Well, I want to turn now to the U.S. relationship with Iran. It's been 40 years since the U.S. hostage taking in Iran. Since then, we've had no official diplomatic relations and no embassy in Iran. Our interests there are represented by Switzerland. While there was extensive contact during the long negotiations for the JCPOA, most communication today is done via press statements and announcements. Ron, you lived in Iran as a younger officer and also were the director of the Iran-Iraq office. You're one of the few who actually lived inside the country. Can you talk a little bit about how, from that perspective, with such limited contacts, how can we manage our relations?
Badly.
Quick and to the point. Okay, next question.
Now, it's true. We tend to look at it very superficially, as they tend to look at us too. I mean, it's a very long period. There is the debility that, from the Iranian side, leaving aside the American perspective, that there are great splits in view within Iran. And there are people for whom the revolution, a key piece of the revolution is death to America, is maintaining the ideological friction. So it creates lots of things. By the way, I had a great time in Iran. I really enjoyed the people. And people who continue to go and visit Iran tell me that they find Iranians as a whole far more welcoming to Americans passing through than many of the Arab states, although our relations with the Arab governments are much better. So if it pays your money, takes your choice. But one of the problems in our relations with Iran is, in Iran, as in America, you have a deep division of people as to whether you ought to have relations, as whether you ought to improve the relations, whether that's a good thing. So when you get into negotiations, you have there, as you have here, a need to show that you're really doing something that works well in order to pacify your domestic critics. And of course, since the same situation exists here, that sets up a situation in which for each side, a successful negotiation is one in which they have to show that they've done really well, which usually means the things that the other side really can't afford to have you show in order to pacify their critics. So that's not an impossible situation, as the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement showed, but it is a very fraught situation in which to hold out negotiations, making it particularly fraught when you have an approach that says, you know, we'll tell you what we want and then we really don't need to talk to you again.
Well, we'll also, afterwards, you can ask him questions about what it was like to live there. The U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, and other parties have remained in, although the EU has warned that they may start withdrawing from the deal. This past fall, there was a report that President Rouhani and President Trump, with the support of the French President Macron, were moving to an agreement which reportedly included lifting of the reimposed U.S. sanctions in exchange for Iran's agreement to remain a non-nuclear weapons state. Gentlemen, what do you think of the prospects of the U.S. and Iran getting back to the table?
Go ahead.
Okay.
And if you disagree, all the better we'll get.
All right. I don't think we can do it on our own. I don't believe that the American government or the Iranian government have any formulas whereby the two of us can get there. It's got to be what Macron is trying to do, but I suspect very strongly it has to be on a grander level than just France, despite its glory. I mean, the P5+1 is probably the only vehicle around. All the principal members of the UN Security Council and the EU, in effect, trying to gang up on both sides. Gang up may be the wrong term, but providing cover for both sides to come to the table and start talking to each other, because frankly, I don't believe that, given the dynamics that Ron was describing, that there is any leeway on each side to make the necessary, even cosmetic concessions that would permit us to come together and have a serious conversation. And what would be worse would be coming together with each side having expectations of the other and not having them met. And frankly, without going into too much detail, I think we're heading for a train wreck with Iran, which could be very damaging to the world's economy should that in the Gulf, because what it would do to what the Iranians demonstrated they could do at Abqaiq in spades. So I think it behooves us and perhaps the Iranians to try and get more international, I can say, intervention, make something work.
I'll take a little bit of issue with Pat and take a slightly more optimistic view, and that is, if you look at the Obama policy on Iran and if you look at the Trump policy on Iran, what you would see are two policies that were pretty much diametrically opposed. The Obama theory of the case that was affected in the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was basically that if you addressed what was the key international concern about Iranian behavior, and that was its pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability, if you put in place an agreement to address that, then over time, by bringing Iran into closer relationship with the international community, addressing their economic concerns, doing other things, you could then set up the possibility of getting the Iranians to address these other issues that I mentioned earlier that were of also a broad concern, about the missiles, about the interference, about support for terrorism. The Trump administration took basically the opposite view, which was, we can't wait, we're not going to wait for the Iranians to come around on their own, they won't do it, and therefore the only way to get them to move on those issues is to basically beat them with a stick until they cry uncle. Where we are right now is that we never really had the opportunity to see whether the Obama approach would work. The Trump approach clearly has not worked. And what we saw with the Macron initiative was an effort to basically begin the dialogue again and to bring the U.S. and Iran together at a table where they could begin to work through some of these issues. I actually think that they can do that. And it's very clear from both the position of Donald Trump himself and from what the Iranians have said, that both sides gingerly are interested in finding a way to get back to the table. Neither of them wants the train wreck that Pat is concerned about, because both sides recognize that a train wreck kills a lot of people, including the engineers. So both sides would like to get back to the table, And the period that we're in right now is the maneuvering between these two sides to figure out who is going to be the stronger party when they sit down at the table. But I do believe that they will sit down at the table probably sometime before our presidential election next year.
Well, optimism is free, so one might as well indulge. But having said that, I'm not quite as optimistic as Jerry. I would just note two things. One is the legacy of suspicion and distrust. And it's not only an American legacy, it's a huge Iranian legacy, going well back into the 50s when we overthrew an Iranian government there, something which the Mossadegh, which they never forget. In fact, I remember my friend John Limbert talking, who was one of the hostages, but who's been a real advocate of the two countries working together. He has a favorite story of talking to an Iranian who said, "But you Americans have to get over that hostage stuff, you know," and he said, "Yes, I agree, we should, but you have to get over Mossadegh." Never was the answer. And in fact, from the Iranian point of view, they have had several initiatives of reaching out to the United States, both in the first Bush administration and later, and feeling that in each case we walked away and betrayed things. So I do not think we are going, we will see. It's a bit risky for anybody to make predictions in a time short enough that you could remember. But you could see this. I think what is more likely, what I'm seeing is there is a flinching. There is a recognition of what Pat was talking about, train wreck possibility, and that's not just the Iranians, that's also the Saudis, the UAE, and so they're tentative, reaching out on various sides. How do we talk about this? How do we deconflict? So I think it is, knock on wood, possible that we may avoid the ultimate stupidity of war, because there is a recognition of just how dangerous that is, and so there's this kind of tentative reaching out, looking for ways to lower the temperature, to deconflict. But I am personally very pessimistic, particularly given the long history, and also this sense, finally, the Iranians had this sense of, hey, we made an agreement, and you walked away from it. So what's the point? Because you can't trust the Americans to hold to an agreement they make anyway. And then, of course, accelerated when you look at Syria and some other things with this administration of, you can't even trust them to keep their own policy straight. So, why get into this? So I'm very pessimistic that you will get to negotiations now. Someday I think it has to happen, but not in the last year before an election, I don't think.
If I can just add, to defend myself, not being overly optimistic,
I agreed with you.
I don't want to be Pollyannish, but the one obstacle to a Rouhani-Trump phone conversation in New York in September was the simple issue that they were not able to decide whether or not a U.S. reduction in sanctions would come before the call or after the call. Right. But the two had agreed fundamentally to make the call. And again, you're absolutely right. I don't think that it will be an easy negotiation. We know it wasn't an easy negotiation in 2015 either. But the reality is, whether you like it or not, the one thing that maximum pressure has done is it has inflicted real economic pain on Iran. And therefore, they have a strong incentive to try to figure out how to deal with us in a way to get sanctions reduction. And I don't think that they're going to do it because they love us. I don't think they're going to do it because they really want to get back in our good books. But I think that both sides will make the decision to go back to the negotiating table because both sides recognize that it's in their interest to do it.
I prefer to have you be right.
I'm going to add one thing, which is I ran the sanctions team at the State Department, and the last time when we squeezed Iran, we also got very, 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 very good at sanctions. Right. So we have capabilities today that we didn't have last time, and they were pretty good. So,
if I could, then off that as well. One is we are very good at sanctions. Now, the Iranians jokingly say that they're offering graduate courses on how to evade American sanctions, but they have more limited capacity to do that. We we have dug ourselves, we collectively, we and the Iranians have, however, both dug ourselves into a public position. Pompeo's ultimatum to the Iranians resembles very much the Austrian ultimatum to the Serbians in August of 1914. It is, surrender everything and then have the leadership commit suicide before we'll talk to you. And I don't see this administration easily backing off it, is my problem. And I don't see the Iranians trusting us that if we have the conversation, that it will happen. I remember when we did have the first reformist Iranian president, Khatami, in which collectively in our wisdom we decided that if we were nice to him it wouldn't work. And we might help the hardliners. I mean, this is partly the mindset that the Iranians are working from, that they see on our side.
We're going to come back here a year from today, and we'll see who was right.
Okay.
Actually, if it's a year from today and I'm right, we're not going to be able to afford the gasoline to get here.
We may have to meet in a bunker, but the United States has a strong military presence in the region. We obviously have troops in Iraq. The Fifth Fleet is in Bahrain, and I know several of you have served in the Gulf. UAE hosting 5,000 military personnel, 10,000 in Qatar on 2 bases. The role of the Kuwait International Airport. We have announced we're sending or have sent more personnel to Saudi Arabia, and we've also launched a new maritime security initiative construct in the region to protect shipping. But many of the Gulf countries are increasing their own capabilities as well. How does this affect power dynamics in the region and our U.S. interests?
Can I take just one
Okay.
quick one? Partly there are this rush to become the owners, not necessarily the users, but the owners of the biggest arsenals in the world, is meant to buttress their ability to deal with the Iranians. But I think even more importantly, it is a bit of a power play between the Gulf states. They don't trust each other. The recent, when Qatar was blockaded by its neighbors, the Qataris felt, I don't know with how much justification, but they convinced themselves that the only reason the Saudis weren't coming across the border is the Saudis hadn't wanted to telegraph their intent by massing on the border. And they credit Tillerson with stopping a Saudi ground attack. Leaving aside the quality of the military forces, simply what's on the books, Saudi Arabia is a much larger, more powerful country than Qatar, and for the time being so is the UAE. The Qataris, I think, see their military as having 2 real functions. One is deterring an attack by their neighbors, long enough for the Americans to get there. And secondly, dealing with the potential of a breakdown in order. For example, they talk a lot about the breakdown of order in Saudi Arabia. Their nightmare would be civil war in Saudi Arabia if something happened, which is something they talk about a lot. I think the UAE's buildup of military force is aimed at Iran and building up the UAE's weight in the Gulf Cooperation Council. And my experience is the UAE has the same sort of dark look at Saudi Arabia's own pretensions. The Saudis have been chipping away at the UAE border for generations. So I think a very large portion of that is part of the jockeying for power between the Gulf states.
You asked particularly about the military balance and how the buildup of Gulf states changes that. The short answer is very little. These are fundamentally weak states who are very aware of their weakness, although the Saudis got a little carried away. But the UAE has made a real effort to expand the quality of its military, and to some extent I think has succeeded and shown a certain ability for power projection effectively. The Saudi military has shown very poorly. It went into Yemen, and it has really done badly. They reminded me when they went in of something my father said to me years ago when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, said every country is entitled to the Vietnam of its choice. I think the Saudis found theirs. But first of all, they are economically powerful and militarily weak. And we often tend to exaggerate, and they want it exaggerated. A lot of the buildup of supplies is so they don't have to use it. I remember reading once that there was a Bedouin technique of riding your camels in a circle to stir up the dust so that the enemy would be frightened by the size of your force and you wouldn't have to fight them. And there is some part of that still going on, I think. Because you look at them, they have enormous dependence on their desalination facilities, on their oil refineries. These things are all extraordinarily vulnerable to missile attack, as the Iranians have just shown. The ability to have these societies really crippled very quickly in a war is very clear. And they have very small populations. They cannot have a large military. They can have a lot of equipment. They can hire a certain number of mercenaries to help them run it, but they do not have the population base to have a strong military. And in several cases, they've gotten used to foreigners doing this stuff. So, the Saudis have had several military experiences, including in the first Gulf War, and in none of them have they shown any particular military adroitness. UAE is the one exception that has a certain power projection. You're talking about less than 2 million people in the whole country. So these are fundamentally weak states. The bottom line is they can get more powerful to some extent for their own protection, not to the extent that we can use that as a change in our relationship.
I would say that there are two critical developments over the last 10 years that have driven these decisions, particularly again by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, to build their own internal security capabilities. One was the perception, rightly or wrongly, the perception that U.S. commitment, U.S. interest, U.S. willingness to carry through on our long-standing defense and security umbrella for the Gulf is fading, and that you can go back to the Obama administration, you can even go back to the George W. Bush administration and see a declining level of interest and commitment to the Gulf states that has played out. The second issue is the collapse of the traditional Sunni Arab leadership, and particularly the internal focus that Egypt has had since 2010, 2011, the collapse, of course, of Syria, of Iraq, as pillars of the Sunni Arab world. And therefore, what you've seen are two things. One, the rise of the Gulf states and their view that they are now responsible for leadership in the Sunni world. And that is exacerbated or compounded by the younger leadership, the more ambitious, aggressive leadership that we have, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, and so therefore, as a result of these two things, we've seen two developments. One is that they are no longer relying on the United States. You see that in both their turn towards a more positive, more focused relations with Russia, with China, but you also see it in terms of their decisions that they are going to take on greater responsibility for their own security, their own protection than they did before. They're not going to wait for the 7th Cavalry to come over the horizon anymore. They're going to take that on themselves. Now, we can talk about whether they're good at it or not so good at it. It doesn't matter. The reality is that that's a decision that they're making, and they're going to pursue it. And that has strong implications in terms of our own role and responsibilities in the region going forward.
I could add just one quick point to this. The number of times I have heard semi-informed American commentators say we don't need the Gulf because we are now an oil exporting country merely reinforces this perception that when the balloon goes up, we're not going to come for them.
And it's complete nonsense.
It is absolute nonsense, yeah.
Well, I want to wrap up asking about putting this in a larger context before we get to the questions. What relevance does the Gulf region have in the broader geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China and between the U.S. and Russia?
I'll take a a swing at China, is I don't think it has to be part of the competition. China is very, very dependent on the Gulf. I forget the numbers. 60% of their energy comes from the Gulf. If there is one country for whom a major war in the Gulf would be catastrophic to their economy, it's China, and I am simply speechless at the Chinese refusal to get involved. The Chinese are simply, maybe it's their whole political history in modern times, they simply don't want to get involved. They have sort of bent, not completely, but they've sort of bent to our sanctions, our blockade of Iranian oil exports. They are the country that has the most to lose, and they're not doing anything. So I don't think they are looking for any sort of confrontation. I honestly do not believe that the Chinese see themselves as the new hegemon moving into the Gulf.
Vladimir Putin is a guy who has played a weak hand very, very well. Russia does not have either the economic or the military or the diplomatic capacity to really challenge the United States in the region, but he is a past master at identifying vacuums and figuring out how Russia can move in. And he is somebody who has a vision of Russia as a great power, who believes that Russia, by dint of its great power status, should have a seat at the table when all of these security and political issues are debated in the Middle East. So he's going to do that. But at the end of the day, he really is not our competition. The competition that the U.S. has in terms of the great powers is China. China is eating our lunch economically. They are becoming increasingly the #1 economic partner for the Gulf states. That's going to continue. I agree with Pat that the Chinese are perfectly willing to let us take on the hard issues of security and stability in the region while they focus on building their economic relations and prospering through their relationships with the Gulf states. But I think that that's also changing. I don't think it's an accident that the only 2 naval facilities that China has outside of mainland China are Gwadar in Pakistan, which guards the Strait of Hormuz, and Djibouti in the Horn of Africa that sits on top of the Bab el-Mandeb, because they understand that their security and their economic survival depends on access through those waterways to the energy and also to the export markets.
Could I say there are no Chinese military forces there?
There are in Djibouti.
In Djibouti there are?
There
Yeah,
are in
they are in
Djibouti.
Djibouti.
And Gwadar has the capability. There's nothing stationed there, but they certainly have the capability of using Gwadar for military. So they are gingerly moving into some of these more aggressive positions. But you're absolutely right that what they want to do is they want us to take the headaches and let them take the money.
Yeah,
That worked.
I do think what you're seeing, though, is overall a less stable world, because I agree with my colleagues that the Gulf states are less secure in their relationship with us, and they are therefore looking elsewhere, and particularly the Russians. The problem is, they're looking to their own defenses and building them. These are policies which they feel they are forced to because they can't rely on the relationship they had with us. But they're not able to supplant that relationship. The Russians will sell them arms, but the Russians are not going to come to their defense. Their own defense capabilities for all the equipment remain weak. So what you have is a relationship where we're not quite backing away. We got a lot of troops there still, but they're unsure of us, and it's not very clear what we're actually prepared to do, where they're making better relationships with countries with which we're uneasy, but which in the end won't solve their dilemma, and building up their arsenals, but without the real capacity to deter the people they're most worried about. And when you add that all together, what you have is a less secure region and a more dangerous one. Because when you had the solid U.S. relationship, clumsy as it might often have been, everybody kind of knew where you were. and therefore you didn't mess with it. Now you have one that's very shaky and uncertain, and that has room for mistakes.
Okay, well, we will now turn to questions.
Ambassadors, thanks so much for being here. My name is Chad Dowding. I'm a first-year MPP student interested in international policy. I'll be giving you your first question. How do you see the increased wave of protests impacting the future of the Iranian regime?
These are the current ones.
Yeah.
Gasoline subsidy removal.
Well, that, you know, it's, you want to predict the future. This is
It's easier to predict the past.
I know. This is really tough. They are posing threats. The regime is incredibly aware of the danger of these riots. You're seeing the fact that there are social cracks after these years since the Iranian Revolution. I personally doubt that this period of riot will lead to that much change. Because I think if there is one lesson that the older leaders of the revolution really learned from the revolution itself, it was how they gained strength as the Shah vacillated. And you had this period in the revolution where the Shah had put down a whole series of revolts before, but in the period of the revolution, he vacillated. He used force. Then 40 days later, at the end of the first mourning period, you'd have bigger demonstrations, and then he wouldn't always. And he moved back and forth. And as he vacillated, the demonstrations got bigger and bigger. And if there's any lesson, which I think the older revolutionary leaders have carried away, it is not to make the mistake of the Shah. And so I believe that they will put these riots down, and they have the problem, they have a lot of force, but they don't have leadership. The revolution had a leadership in the wings ready to come forth and take hold. I don't think they have it. So I think you have something here that's analytically very interesting. It shows you how much dissatisfaction there is, whether or not after this you get something else. But I don't believe these riots themselves are going to lead to a lot of change real quick.
I would say that I would agree completely with that. The absence of, for example, a coherent or popular Iranian revolutionary presence abroad. I mean, right now the United States has chosen to support probably the single most hated Iranian exile organization, the MEK, as the substitute. Yeah, I mean,
they used to try to kill us, but now people like Giuliani and even former General Jones go off and give speeches for money.
Yeah.
And the other, I think I saw something today which said that they have already killed about 100 demonstrators in Iran, and I agree completely with Ron that they are going to do whatever they need to do in order to stop these demonstrations. They've been very clear, and what you need to remember is that the methodology that Bashar al-Assad has used in Syria, he was taught by the Iranians. That is really, it's the IRGC that went into Syria and really helped Bashar use the extreme measures that he's used in order to stop the Syrian uprising.
The riots in Iraq have much more potential for political change, but that wasn't the question.
Okay.
All right, thank you all again for being here. Sorry. My name is Karuna Nankumar, and I am a junior in the Ford School undergraduate program focusing in diplomacy and international security. The next question that we have for you is, how do U.S. relations in the Gulf interact with U.S. relations with Israel? In particular, how would a cooling of U.S.-Saudi relations, for example, with the bill to end U.S. involvement with Saudi Arabia in Yemen, impact Israel?
There was a theory in the Trump administration that because the Israelis and the Gulf share the same concerns about Iran, that there was therefore an opportunity to actually push forward on this idea of what's called outside in, that in other words you could get the Gulf states to take steps to normalize their relationship with Israel on this basis, and to open diplomatic relations, to do all of the other steps, regardless of where the Israelis were in their negotiations with the Palestinians. I think that what we've seen over these past couple of years is that expectation, that idea, was vastly exaggerated. And that while the two sides, there's no doubt that quietly under the table, Israelis and Gulf Arabs are working much more closely together, that the Gulf states are more willing to be open about the nature of some of their relationships, particularly on the security side, than they were in the past. Nevertheless, there is a cap on how far they're going to be willing to go in the absence of some movement towards a resolution of the Palestinian issue, and particularly what's called the Arab Peace Initiative, which is basically full normalization between Israel and the Arab world in exchange for a two-state solution, Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. This is the position. It is still the position, and I think that the reality is that unless there is something that addresses Palestinian requirements, you're not going to see the Gulf states go beyond that.
If I could add one point, I've seen this movie before in the course of my career. There have been, I can think of three historical instances when American policy, beginning with the momentary CENTO alliance that led to the overthrow of the monarchy in Iraq, where we were going to get Israel and the further Arab states, Iraq and the Gulf states, allied against the Soviet Union. And then we tried it a couple more times. When I was in Abu Dhabi, Alexander Haig was building trying to build a alliance against, I keep even forget if it was the Soviet Union or Iran at that point, but it was the Soviet Union, again with the Gulf states. So we've done this several times. We think that...
But as we have no memory, it's always a fresh idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next question.
Next question for you. What are the most effective strategies for combating Iranian-backed groups in the Middle East, such as Hamas and the Quds forces in Iraq?
Since we haven't seen one yet, it's hard to know what an effective strategy will be.
Can I just say very simply, one sentence? Doing our best to fix the problem so you dry up the swamp in which they dwell. That, in other words, if you try to deal with them directly, this is their turf. They know their turf. They know how to survive in that turf. If we progress on the Palestinian issue, I don't even know how to deal with Iraq. I couldn't even begin at this moment to suggest how we deal with the Iraqis.
Iraq's an interesting case because the Iranians have gotten a lot of power in Iraq, but the Iranians are not well liked in Iran, and Americans often make the mistake of thinking because there are a lot of Shia in Iraq that therefore somehow very close to the Iranians. They forget that 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war with thousands of people killed, the foot soldiers of Iraq were mostly the Shia, and they never changed sides. They never went over, against their own government. And in fact, when I served in Iraq after our invasion, it was not good for you if you were an Iraqi politician to be seen as too close to the Iranians. And now you're getting a lot of pushback. The Iranians do best in Iraq when the country is unstable, because then they can work with different power centers for their own interests. They have always had the risk that a stable Iraq will be a threat to Iran again, as it was all the way back to the Battle of Karbala, in the 8th century. So this is not like a new thing. We keep reminding you that things are not so new. So right now they have a hard time. I think it's clear. I think one can say that some things one should not do are much clearer than exactly how to affect this. Iraqis are really tired of foreigners messing about in their lives and their wars and making their wars. And so right now, when you've got a lot of backlash against Iranian pressure, is a good time for us to kind of shut up and sit down and not to be very heavily involved. Consult quietly with people, but you've got a very volatile politics. You've got some things that are going in a direction that we kind of like. So don't try, we have a desire usually to do something. And this is one of those places where you're much better off right now. Watch it go. You may see an opportunity to do something useful, but don't assume you have to do something.
Can I just one quick point, just to set at rest this question of Shia, Iranian Shia control influence over Iraq. If looking at it in theological terms, Najaf and Karbala are Rome and Constantinople. At best, Qum is Canterbury, and maybe
this
not even.
Requires a certain historical perspective to know what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I hope you all understood that.
If I can just add, Houthi, the Houthi experience in Yemen, and I think it kind of sharpens the point that Ron and Pat were making, and that is that each of these instances where the Iranians have been able to establish relations, to work, to build alliances, relationships, is really kind of unique to that particular set of circumstances. So in the case of Yemen, where you have the Houthis, yes, they have a relationship with Iran. Yes, they have exploited that relationship, and the Iranians have exploited the relationship with the Houthis in order to achieve an objective that they have, which is to stress and put pressure on Saudi Arabia. But nevertheless, the issues that are unique to the conflict that's going on in Yemen right now are issues that are internal to Yemen. The Houthis are not fighting because they are partners or proxies of Iran. They're fighting because of their circumstances in Yemen. And the best thing that we can do, to the extent that we can do it, is to help resolve those internal issues. If you deny the Iranians the vacuum that they have been very successful at exploiting, then you can deny them the air that they need in order to develop these relationships. And that's true, I think, with Hamas. It's true in Iraq. It's true with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And it's absolutely true with the Houthis in Yemen.
But the basic point that underlies all of these is you have to actually know something. And you have to pay attention to the different situations and the differences. And you can't do this on the basis of kind of two-dimensional policy and sound bites about Iran, which is, of course, where we carry out our public discussion.
You have to know about Canterbury.
That's right. That too.
Okay, we'll go to the next question.
All right, so next we have a question turning towards combating terrorism. Can the Arab coalition of states led by MBS, considering some of MBS's actions in the region, be trusted to combat terrorism in a manner that is in line with U.S. and global geopolitical interests?
Maybe sometimes no.
Mostly no.
It depends on what terrorism you're talking about.
Yeah.
I think that the Saudis were good partners for us, for example, in fighting against Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We had a lot of success, and in fact, there was one particular instance you may or may not remember called the printer cartridge bomb attempt, which was in 2010. It was right when I got to Sana'a, where there was an attempt to smuggle explosives on board an airplane in printer cartridges. We would not have known about that. We would not have caught on to that had it not been for Saudi intelligence. And they're tipping us off and also the British off about this plot. So there have been instances where, in fact, they were extremely important partners for us. There are other areas where we work closely together. But then you also have the larger issue, frankly, where Saudi policy has, in fact, on occasion exacerbated terrorist threats and has made it more difficult for us to deal with, Libya being a good example.
See,
Next question for you. How does Turkey and President Erdogan fit into the equation?
Badly.
Yeah. Turkey has a lot of its own agenda. It's feeling its oats as it's moved into Syria. It has, again, Turkey has helped in certain areas. It has helped combat extreme movements. At the same time, in parts of Syria, you have Turkey being quite tolerant of movements that are allied with the Islamic State because the Turks are worried about other things. They're far more worried about Kurdish terrorism than they are worried about the Islamic State. So if helping works, they'll help. But if helping gets us fight the Islamic State, gets crossways with where they see a stronger threat and interest, then they're not so helpful. Turks also are really feeling their oats on a kind of expansion of their influence. This is like Turkish policy 2.0 because they had this sort of same view right after the breakup of the Soviet Union. We're really going to expand. These are all Muslim countries in Central Asia. And they found that the lift was way heavier than they had the capacity to undertake. Now they're kind of trying some of that again. And again, I think they're going to find that their ambitions, their reach, I think, exceeds their grasp.
And I would add that there's an internal dynamic. President Erdogan came to power how many years now? His first 7-8 years in power were fantastic. He the best ruler, best leader of modern Turkey you could possibly imagine. He really made an enormous difference for Turkey. Someplace along the line, whether it's megalomania, miscalculation, or something, he has had problems. The problems reflect themselves in election results, local elections that have not gone well for him. And like most guys who want to, like most leaders who want to stay in power, an occasional foreign adventure is not necessarily a bad thing, properly managed.
Okay, so during your comments towards the beginning of this section, you commented on the potential of some sort of movement or lack of potential for movement in Iranian-U.S. relations. I'm wondering, what does the recent rise in tensions between Israel and Iran, marked by the Israeli Air Force strikes against targets in Syria a couple days ago, suggest about Iranian ambitions in Syria, and what is the risk of this turning into a larger conflict and kind of impacting this potential for change?
This is one of those places where I don't believe that the two countries really have an existential view of the other one as a threat. I think this is a large part of this is Iran trying to maintain its controls or its influence in Syria, and in large part this is Israeli domestic politics because it's really useful to have the Iranians as the boogeyman sitting out there. So I think this is more of a hype inside the United States and domestically in both countries as hype rather than, let me rephrase that, I don't think either country wants to have a war with the other.
There's no doubt that the Iranians were far more invested in the survival of Bashar al-Assad and his regime in Damascus than the Russians are. That for Iran, Bashar is an important partner. Access to Lebanon and to Hezbollah through Syria is incredibly important. I think for their own reasons, the Iranians see the ability to expand their military partnership with Hezbollah in Syria as well as in Lebanon is useful, particularly in terms of threatening Israel. The Israelis have responded. I think the interesting thing is that the Israelis have responded extremely aggressively against Iranian presence. They have gone after Iranian arms depots. They've gone after Iranians. They've killed a number of Iranians in Syria. They've killed a number of Iranians now in Iraq. The response from Tehran has been zero. And I think it's one of those situations, frankly, where the two sides have decided that this is a game that they're going to play, and they're going to keep it confined to this particular battleground, and they're not going to allow it to spill out into other kinds of conflict.
All right, thank you.
How does the current state of U.S.-Iran relations affect U.S. diplomatic efforts in the country to Iran's east, Afghanistan?
In Afghanistan. In Afghanistan. What's happening in Afghanistan, the Iranians, it's useful to remember, were initially quite supportive of our intervention in Afghanistan. There's a big difference between the way the Iranians look at Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq is a historic threat to Iran. When I was in Iran under the Shah years ago, every year in Western Iran, the troops had an annual military exercise where they exercised on the basis of the Iraqi invasion of Iran, dropping back, the reconstitution of forces, pushing the Iraqis back. Afghanistan's not a strategic threat. They get nervous about us. So the Iranians were very helpful in the Bonn negotiations, in putting a government in place in Afghanistan. I think I had probably the last meeting we used to meet with the Iranians in Afghanistan up until 2005. I had the last such meeting that then was ordered to suspend those because we wanted to put pressure on them about nuclear weapons. I argued with Secretary Rice that that was a bad decision. I lost. Anyway,
She was the boss.
Yeah, she was boss. But anyway, they remained fairly supportive, very nervous about when we'd put troops close to their border, but otherwise basically supportive. They became a little more belligerent, pushing on the Afghans during the period of Ahmadinejad in Iraq, in Iran. But now the kicker is that they are very concerned about two things. One is the growth of the Islamic State presence in Afghanistan, and the other is the perception that we're not going to hold up our continued involvement in Afghanistan. And they can't, the situation is going to get worse. So from their point of view, the greater danger between Taliban and Islamic State is the Islamic State. So if that means that they need to warm up their relations with the Taliban in order to prepare for the expected panic departure of the U.S. and the collapse of Afghanistan, that's what they're doing. So you have a definite warming of relations between the Iranians and the Taliban, as you have between the Russians and the Taliban. And in both cases, it is premised on the two perceptions: Islamic State is a bigger threat to me, if you're Russian, Iranian, and I can't trust the Americans to hold up their end in Afghanistan. They're going to walk out and leave chaos, and I got to have friends.
Okay.
Thank you. So, turning to kind of humanitarian issues, how concerned should we be about the human costs of sanctions on Iran for ordinary Iranian civilians?
How much we should be, or how much are we? Should be.
Should be.
If you're looking at it from a purely moral and ethical point of view, it's a little bit like our sanctions on Iraq in the lead up to the 2003 war, in which we frankly we took a position that the humanitarian crisis that we had created in Iraq was the fault of Saddam Hussein, and we tried to sell that domestically. I don't think we ever managed to sell it. If we try and sell the same story in Iran, I don't think it's going to be sold. The humanitarian, we've caused there was always been a bit of humanitarian crisis. We've aggravated the humanitarian crisis in Iran, and with a few exceptions, I think the Iranian government will do a remarkably good job of convincing the Iranian people it's the Americans' fault.
And that's a really important point, because, one, the official U.S. position is that we are not interested in punishing the Iranian people. We are interested in putting pressure on the regime. But the reality is exactly the opposite, that in fact the weight of U.S. sanctions is falling on the common people. And as Ron said earlier, and my wife is in the tourism business, and up until we got married a few years ago, she used to lead tours to Iran. I told her to stop. But she used to lead tours, and she said that the Americans on her tours were always amazed about the warmth of the reception that they got. The fact that the common Iranian people liked Americans, and they liked America, and they felt as though, were it not for the political differences, that they would be able to have a good relationship with us. The risk that we run is that we are changing that perception, and that we're building opposition, we're building anger against the United States among the Iranian population. And that's going to do two things. One is it's going to strengthen the regime, because it means that, as Pat said, the regime can say, it's not us, we're not the reason that the economy is collapsing, we're not the reason that things, that your life is so difficult, it's because of those Americans. And the second thing is that when the day comes, and it will come, that we would like to normalize the relationship with Iran, that we would like to get back to business with Iran, that there's going to be popular resistance within Iran to doing that, that's going to make it much harder to achieve our objectives.
Let me add just a comment on sanctions. Sanctions are an effective tool if you outline clearly the behavior that you want to change. Mm-hmm. In the current long list of sanctions on Iran, and I'm not an expert on Iran, there is no desired behavior that's enunciated. In other words, we don't have a clear policy of what we want them to do, other than, denuclearize generally. Again, if you outline what you want to have, the behavior. When I say also, let me add another point, in fine-tuning, we're able to allow exceptions and to allow certain things to go through, etc. But the intent is really for the behavior of a state to change. The Trump administration, as I just said, has not enunciated exactly what it wants to achieve. So the pressure is felt. Politically, it is, played up domestically. And the longer they run, the harder they hit.
Actually, there's even, I'd take the same point and take it further of lack of clarity. Because the deepest lack of clarity, and this has been true for several administrations, not just for this one, American, is whether our policy is about change in behavior or about regime overthrow.
Yeah, that's good.
And as long as, and we send mixed signals, as long as the belief, there's a possibility that what our policy is really about is regime change, then there's no reason to make the concessions necessary, because you're just weakening yourself and you're setting yourself up for the next round. So the concessions which we say we want in sanctions on behavior, it really only makes sense even if you wanted to have that agreement, if you believe that that's what the Americans are really about. It's not about regime change. And the way we talk about this leaves you very uncertain of what the policy is or what the policy will be tomorrow.
And some sanctions are very targeted. I mean, we sanctioned, for example, some Russians in the context of cyber. It's very targeted, like stop hitting us, we're going to sanction, and then we'll use more, offensive ways through cybercom. Any other questions?
Last question.
It's between this and cocktail time.
What's your advice on how students interested in Middle East diplomacy can best prepare to succeed?
All right, gentlemen, with all your years of wisdom.
I'll try the first one, which is succeed at what you're doing right now. Come out of here, do well in school, do well, and then just get to know as much as you can about the Middle East. There is no magic formula. It's simply a well-educated person who has educated himself on the region and who has a real interest, not just academic, but you need to start developing a visceral interest in the area, like all three of us got stuck with. And that's the best way to prepare for it.
Yeah.
Did you choose it or stumble into it related to
I stumbled. Most of my life I've stumbled into things, and I stumbled into this. Yes.
This one I chose.
it? Okay.
Yeah, actually I had 3.5 months after graduate school before joining the military, and went out to visit my parents in Afghanistan, and that was really where I sort of began to develop a strong interest in the Muslim world. I would say, I mean, there's any number of things. We could all pontificate for hours up here, and that would really delay the cocktail. But you'll never be fully expert. You have to recognize what a colleague told me going to one post, when she said, "You will never understand this country as clearly as on the day you arrive." Because you think you have a perception, you get into the details, you learn more and more, it gets harder and harder to make simple bottom line judgments. So recognize that this is a lifetime business. That's not to be discouraged, but it means understand that what you come out of here with is a basis on which to go forth and learn. It is not a basis of knowledge sufficient to already proclaim how things ought to be. So prepare yourself, but the history, these are countries which have an enormous, and true of much of the world, an enormous sense of history. And this is often an impediment to them. It's really hard to go forward quickly when you're spending all your time looking backwards. But you need to understand the history. You need to understand where people are coming from. Then you go, and then you learn to listen. And my old boss, the late Hal Saunders, who was very involved in Arab-Israeli negotiations and other things, who really had an understanding of the psychological dimensions of negotiations as well. And he had a saying which was, listen deeply enough to be changed by what you hear. And it's an enormously important point of both scholarship and diplomacy. If you want to get other people to do things your way and like it, you have to know what their way is. So as well as the history and knowledge, having a certain amount of humility and learning to listen and spend a lot of time listening is a good thing to learn.
Could I just add one slightly flip answer? Very early on, I had to make a choice between studying Russian and studying Arabic. And I realized that if I was going to study either of these languages, I'd spend the next 15 to 20 years of my life in that part of the world. And frankly, I like lamb better than I like cabbage.
Well, on that uprising note, I want to thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to the audience. It was a great session.
Thank you. And outside, we'll have a reception to celebrate the end of our Wiser Diplomacy Center launch. I don't believe we're serving cabbage. There may be lamb. But please, one more round of thanks for this wonderful panel from the American Academy of Diplomacy.